All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to California Wine Institute's Behind the Wines with our host, Elaine Chukan Brown. Thank you all for taking the time out to be with us today. This month, California Wine Institute's Behind the Wines series brings a regional focus to our continued exploration of the development of the Golden States wine industry and its place on the world stage. Host Elaine will speak with leading authorities in wine media, education, hospitality, and science to weigh in on the state of California wine and offer insights about general perceptions on the subject in their respective communities. These conversations will highlight the exchanges between California and other great wine regions of the world, the common threads as well as the varied approaches to viticulture and winemaking. Today, we have the great pleasure to welcome award-winning food and wine and travel entrepreneur, André Ribeirinho. Before we get started, some housekeeping reminders for everyone. During the webinar, note that there are two communication methods available to participants, a chat section and a Q&A section. The chat section is an informal way for you to communicate with other participants. Just be sure to select everyone in the to field as it can default to panelists only. The Q&A section is where we'd like you to submit your questions to be answered during the webinar, and we will do our best to address your questions, but for those that are not answered live, we will provide a Q&A summary in the email you'll receive following the program. So now I'd like to introduce our host, Elaine. In addition to writing for her own site, Waka Waka Wine Reviews, she serves as the American specialist for JancysRobinson.com and contributes to a long list of respected publications. She contributed to the 8th edition of the World Atlas of Wine, which has won multiple awards very recently, as well as the award-winning 4th edition of the Oxford Companion to Wine. She was named by the International Wine and Spirits Competition and Vinitaly as one of the world's top wine communicators of the year for the last 2 years in a row. And André, trained as a computer science engineer, André is also a Portuguese wine expert, certified Port Educator, and a Knight of the Port Wine Brotherhood. Often called a digital strategist, André is co-founder and CEO at Adegga, creating and leading projects such as Adegga MarketPlace, Adegga WineMarket, Portugal Wine Week, and others. He is Portugal's correspondent to Hugh Johnson's Pocket Wine Book and contributes to Decanter. Now, Elaine, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Katie. Nice to see you, André.
Nice to see you too.
And it's lovely to see that you can sit outside there in Portugal as well.
It's lovely. Now there's some shade now here, so it feels comfortable talking on the balcony. Hello,
That's
everyone.
Great. And just so people know, you're in Lisbon, yes?
Yes, I'm in Lisbon, so I'm more or less in the center of the country, and it's the capital of Portugal, and not far from the ocean, from where I am.
Well, and I love that we're getting to have this conversation. I think people don't tend to assume bringing California and Portugal together, but I think that's part of what makes it really exciting. And I'm also really excited to do this as a conversation rather than just an interview. I know we both have a lot of curiosity about each other's work and each other's countries in wine. So why don't we go ahead and just start by looking at maps, because you and I have spoken through some of the parallels and differences of our two regions. And so I think it'd be great to just start there and give people some perspective on where we're talking about.
Let's do that.
Okay. So as always, Katie's put together these fantastic maps that really give us a great overview. And this Google map helps you see the real texture of the region. And you can see in California, what's really important is it's a mix of oceans and mountains that define the influence of the state. And you can see in this case, the very dark green areas are actually the mountains of California. And that's because they are generally covered in forest. So the far western side has a bank of mountains, the coastal range. And then the far eastern side has another bank of mountains, the Sierra foothills, which protect the state from the much warmer inland area that starts there with Nevada. But one of the most important parts of California wine growing is that there on the western side is the Pacific Ocean, and that's one of the coldest ocean currents in the world. And so what I want to note here about California that'll help set us up in comparing it to Portugal is notice California is on the western side of its landmass and heavily influenced by the ocean. So if we zoom into the next map, we get just a very nice overview, a very simple overview of like major wine regions of California. You'll notice again, the gray area there in the center is the Central Valley, which is created by those two banks of mountains that we described. But again, the ocean is on the west. So now if we go into looking at maps of Portugal, André, could you talk us through what we see here?
Sure. So Portugal is located, is the westernmost, most western country in continental Europe. And it's actually, of course, in Southern Europe. It's part of what we call the Iberian Peninsula. And as you can see there, we actually have a border. We actually have a border with Spain on our north border and on the eastern border. On the north border, we actually have mountains across with Spain. So across the border, you'll find the region of Galicia in Portugal. And inside Portugal, you find Vinho Verde, Trás-os-Montes, and just below it, you'll find Douro and down, and then down from there. And as you can see in this map, we actually have a long, very long shore that goes from the north of Portugal to, again, the Algarve here in the south, again, next to Spain. And so also has in California, the ocean, as we see in the picture, is actually on our left. And so on the west side of the country. And so we are heavily influenced by the Atlantic Ocean instead of the Pacific. And if we can zoom into the other map, and you can see here a division of the country by regions. We do have 12 regions, and inside the regions, we are divided in terms of quality by DOCs and IGPs, so the quality level regulations that allow the producers to label wines and to use different varieties and to control yields depending on where they are. And if we want to consider just in terms of weather, actually the orange area is also the hottest area in Portugal, but also the red area where Douro is at the top. And then it makes sense, it's green, as you see at the top left corner. You have the biggest region in Portugal in terms of productions, which is Vinho Verde right at the top. And this map is actually readily available online. So if you want to check all the sub-regions and what they mean, that there are some really well-known sub-regions here, like Bruxelles and of course the world-known Colares, where you still have very old vineyards planted in sand that survived phylloxera, and you'll find those on the pink area just above Lisbon, right on the west side, just in front of the ocean.
Really, I have not been able to visit Colares, but the wines are incredible. It's really been exciting every time I've been able to have those. One of the things to point out too is just that with California, there's a really clear mountain boundary that is created and helps define the state and inform the way the ocean influences the region. Whereas in Portugal, again, that there's the comparison with the ocean is on the west and all the weather comes from the west primarily because of where we're each located in the landmass. But you have mountains kind of dotted in places rather than a full bank of mountains like we have.
So what we have is, we do have a few mountains that influence heavily some of the regions. For example, in Vinho Verde, you have an area called Monção e Melgaço, which is very famous for the kind of Alvarinho that they're producing there. And the reason the Alvarinho there is, or one of the reasons the Alvarinho there is so good is because actually the region is enclosed between the continental weather and also protected from the ocean weather from these mountains around the area. But of course, also Douro is kind of protected from the maritime weather, also from a mountain there. And then if you go to the Down, one of the reasons Down makes some amazing wines is actually because it's protected and it creates this microclimate that allows the grapes to mature much more slowly than elsewhere in the country.
Yes.
But of course, if you start going down, there are not a lot of mountains. And of course, when you get to the Alentejo, it's mostly flat.
Right. One of the things that I have seen that's parallel there as well is, so for example, in the Douro, visiting some producers there, I've seen they're like really seeking higher elevation vineyards because, like you said, the Douro is quite warm. And we really see that in California as well. There's this realization that that elevation can play a great advantage in terms of helping to shift the growing conditions of the region that you're in. And so in both places, I see producers kind of looking to those higher elevation areas to help shift the expression of the wines.
Yeah, we do see that happening definitely in the Douro, where producers are looking for higher plots of land to plant their vineyards, or finding, for example, for white wines, a lot of the best white wines come from high altitude vineyards. But not only that, because we are facing problems, of course, with climate change. You do see, for example, port producers or Douro producers moving out of the Douro and looking for other regions. And famously, the Symingtons have bought a property in the upper part of the Alentejo region, of course, trying to do making wine in other regions, and of course, looking for quality and for freshness. But at the same time, and I'm not sure this is more of a question, I don't know if this happens also in California, but for example, some of the producers in the Alentejo, in the hottest wine region in Portugal, instead of going to higher places, they went near the sea. And so what you have now, you have some of the vineyards like you have in Colares. You have those kind of shoreside vineyards. Just below Lisbon, you have Setúbal, and then below Setúbal, you have a part of the Alentejo that is highly influenced by the Atlantic. And you have a couple of producers making very fresh Alentejo wines in that region.
Yes, I think that if you look at the history of California, it's very much kind of, there's this push towards the coast and also into the higher elevation areas. And so I think that's just something that, you know, as we talk about climate change and how producers in different parts of the world are addressing it, that seems to be a common theme for producers around the world. They're finding not just different varieties to consider and not just different farming methods, but also, excuse me, also trying to get closer to cool pockets that previously would have been too cold to plant in, you know, and we've seen that very much here in California as well, moving into the coast.
Yeah, and I think that actually the blend of all those new methods and using different varieties that weren't used in that places before is actually one of the big things that we're doing overall to try to fight climate change. And you do see things happening like Sauzão is now being used in the Alentejo and increasingly being used in ports. And actually, a grape from the Alentejo, Alicante Boucher, is being used now in the Douro also in many ports to add freshness. So you see, I think it's going to be a combination of many of these improvements, and a study, of course, of some of the producers are doing all these ampelographic fields studies where they're studying hundreds of varieties and see how they adapt to new climate conditions, and I think we're going to see a lot more of these varieties. This is one of the richness that we have, that we're able to use all these different varieties and try to find which ones are going to help us fight climate change. And it's a luxury that we have in Portugal, because we do have a history of working with so many.
Well, so I'm excited that you brought up Alicante Boucher, because it's actually one of California's great historic grapes. And I think a lot of people don't realize that some of our founding varieties actually do come from Portugal. A lot of the French varieties, of course, kind of became the more known and the more plentiful. But in California, that's actually only since the late 70s that's true. And so historically, if you go back into grape harvest reports from the late 1800s, they actually very carefully track the different varieties that are being harvested in California. And as we know, the very first varieties planted in California came from monks of Spain, but actually part of the state was founded by monks that came from Galicia. And so they actually brought, later started focusing on cuttings that were both from Spain and from Portugal. Which
is really, really interesting.
Yes, and if you look at these grape harvest reports from the late 1800s, they're actually very carefully comparing the same varieties but brought from Spain versus brought from Portugal to see how they do. But also, you know, and so Bastardo there in Portugal, known as Trousseau in Spain, has actually kind of re-emerged as a very great interest here in California. There's actually quite a few producers now bottling under the name Trousseau, though. But many of those cuttings actually originate from Portugal, interestingly enough. But then Alicante Bouschet actually, similar to what you're describing there with field blends in Portugal, Alicante Bouschet was founded as one of the field blend varieties of the great old vine vineyards here in California. We would call them mixed blacks vineyards historically. But so those would generally have kind of a heart of Zinfandel, but they would then be interplanted with other varieties that were important for kind of rounding out the wine. And Alicante Bouschet was one of the really core kind of sister varieties planted with Zinfandel. And because, like you said, it brings that freshness, but also the thing that I've seen is it brings like a really kind of pure fruit freshness. So it sort of helps fill in the flavor in this beautiful way. And so the history of California is actually really founded with quite a few Portuguese varieties. And part of why I wanted to speak with you today is because what I think we're seeing is that as California shifts and tries to understand climate change, but also its own identity in new ways, I think California could find a lot of the varieties from Portugal really grow very well here.
Are people planting? I've heard that some people are planting Touriga Nacional, for example. It's something that has been used in different, also Tinta Roriz, of course, Tempranillo, many different productions. But I'm interested, is Touriga Nacional something that has been spreading in California or less so?
Well, so a lot of the Portuguese varieties, they're kind of emerging in small quantities. And so Touriga Nacional so we have the kind of historic period, you know, in the 1800s, these different cuttings come in and people work with them and establish them in field blends. And then in the 90s, there was sort of a California port boom. A lot of people were getting interested in the idea that California would make a great sweet wine or sticky wine. And so there was this increase in plantings of these varieties that you're referring to, but with the interest of making sweet wine. But what's interesting to me too is that a lot of those, like Touriga Nacional and Tinta Roriz, which of course is known as Tempranillo from Spain, those came into California, but mainly in mountain regions. So we have some Touriga Nacional up in Lake County, which is north of Napa. And then also again in Sierra foothills, there's a mix of these varieties as well. But more recently, what I find interesting is in Lodi, there's actually a Portuguese focused vineyard. And so Ron Silva has actually planted a whole vineyard that you can kind of walk through the vines and you'll see sort of a cataloging of the Portuguese varieties he's been able to get access to here in California. And he has at least 20 different varieties, and Sazao is among them. He recently was able to add Mencia. There's very little Mencia here in California. Yeah. But he's seen they do very well in our climate and our environment, which I think is exciting.
Yeah, it should be really, really interesting to try to compare studies on what Portugal is doing with of course with this extensive range of varieties and understanding what works and what doesn't, and of course comparing what is happening in California. Even if the weather is slightly different, there are of course many similarities. One of the interesting studies one of the interesting developments that I was reading about a few days ago is this idea of doing a polyclonal. So the whole idea of planting different clones of the same variety, and the basic idea is the same as in a field blend as it was being used in the past. that, of course, in different vintages, you'll have different behaviors from the different clones or the different varieties in a field blend. And in a way that kind of compensates, when it's a good year for ones, and it's a less good year for the other ones, and they kind of compensate and they end up producing something very good. And of course you can work around that. And as we're fighting climate change, you do have a number of people studying in some of the bigger companies in Portugal. You do have people studying and focusing just on that, on trying to understand how different clones of the same variety can use to the same effect of a field blend. And it's really exciting. I think I'm sure they're comparing notes with their California peers and understanding what's going on and what is working and what is not working.
Yes, that's so interesting. I've seen that to some extent here in California, but mainly actually with Chardonnay and Pinot. People are very clonally minded in the United States and I think in the New World in general around Chardonnay and Pinot, but I haven't seen that as much with other varieties. But one of the things you mentioned, Touriga Nacional, and Bordeaux, of course, is experimenting with bringing
yes.
other varieties in small quantities as a kind of as an acid addition, a natural acid addition, you could say, in response to climate change. But here in California, Larkmead actually in North Napa, kind of between St. Helena and Calistoga, has an experimental vineyard growing unexpected varieties, and there's a few Portuguese varieties there as well. And again, looking to parts of the world and asking, what varieties there handle the heat and retain acid at the same time, and these different areas of Portugal is a good example for some of those.
We were just we were having this discussion on Twitter the other day about I was actually tasting a Tinto Cão that was making it's 100% Tinto Cão rosé from the Dodo, and one of the best rosés in Portugal at the moment, made by Sogevinos. And Elizabeth Agabe was actually commenting that she was tasting a Tinto Cão 100% from, I think was Israel. And so suddenly you were tasting a Portuguese
wow.
variety, quite a big distance between them. And I would love to have tasted both. She did taste both, and I would love to have tasted them, because it's so interesting that we can actually try to understand how a grape is going to develop on another terroir. At the same time, I'm saying this from the point of view of a country that, of course, works with over 250 different varieties and the richness that we have. And I'm saying this also from I'm not against having foreign varieties in Portugal. I think it's fun to play with. I think it's interesting as a wine lover. I love the idea of tasting all different kinds of wines in Portugal. Of course, I'm comfortable saying this because at the same time, we're still using mostly native varieties, and that's the most exciting part. Yeah, that's the Tinto Cão that Luciana is mentioning.
Yes.
Exactly.
Well, so you've mentioned Twitter, and one of the things I really want to talk about with you too is just how wine has evolved so significantly through these different means of communication. And I think that sometimes social media gets it's not taken seriously. And a lot of times people assume that, it's just a side diversion, people are wasting their time with it. When actually, one of the things you just pointed out is that there's really quite serious, robust conversations and connections in wine happening even through just a few allowable characters in Twitter. And you and I even originally connected through social media, and then that led to other connections. But part of what I'm getting at is that I've actually also seen that these social media conversations, we're actually learning from each other through them, but that kind of increased connectivity and increased source of knowledge is actually playing out in winemaker choices as well. People are realizing, maybe I should explore this variety and see if I want to plant it based on what they're learning from these connections in social media. And so it really reflects a completely different way of communicating in the world of wine. And you've actually played a really important role in that, and had quite a big influence on that, especially in Europe, through founding Adegga. So I was hoping you could tell us a little bit more about, those original insights that you gained through starting Adegga, and also how you see that sort of shifting percolating through the world of wine in general?
So I'll touch a few different points. One of the, I think, most important points that we should talk about, I think it's the fact that if you think about wine media today, what were printed magazines or are still printed magazines, but less so today, what you see is that the printed magazines or the printed media or the wine printed media who have addressed the new channels have had different success from the ones who haven't. So every time, this is historically, every time you have a new way of communicating, being newspapers and then radio and then TV and then social media, or then internet and then social media after that, what you see is that people start by complaining against the new medium, that it's not something that people trust or that's not serious enough. And I would say that if in 2020 you're not using the internet to communicate about wine, you're not getting enough people to read about you and what you're doing. So that's a really important point, because I still see a number of people, sometimes it's a strong word, but sometimes bashing what is being done that is new. And there are a number of new wine media that maybe sometimes they should be done in a different way. Maybe they should be more careful and fact checking and all that. It's a problem that we have with social media, but has ways of reaching consumers and has ways of sharing wine information. They are doing much better than the old wine media is doing. And so I think we should learn from that media and sometimes even work with them to make them better so that more people have access to wine information. So that's one of the key, I think, ideas that I think I'll try to get people to be more respectful, at least try to select the channels. There are always in every channel, as we know from newspapers and from TV, there's always going to be good TV and bad TV. There's going to be good social media and bad social media. We just need to be more careful in selecting our sources. But I did start, I remember so when I started blogging, and it wasn't about wine at the time, I started blogging in 1999 when I was still doing computer science university, and I found out that organizing posts by reverse chronological order was something that was interesting to do, and a few other people were doing in the world. There were no blogs. They were the first blogs were created around that time. And as I was progressing, at some points, I started by being a consulting computer science engineer. So I worked for a few different companies. And sometime around 2005, 2006, I read a book called The Long Tail. The Long Tail is a great book by Chris Anderson, and he was the guy who was the editor at Wired magazine at the time. And one of the things that he explained with this concept of the long tail was he was trying to explain why the internet was changing the business of movies and the business of books and the business of music. That suddenly, before you have a physical limitation on selling these items, and suddenly with the internet, you didn't have a physical limitation, right? So catalogs could be endless. And actually this is connected to information, because what is happening today, the way people search for information about wine is mostly using Google. That's the main place people search for information about wine, right? And so in 2006, when we at Adegga created one of the first social networks around wine, what we were trying to do was actually trying to get people to search for the name of a wine or search for information about wine, and then connect with other people based on the fact that they were also searching for that wine. So there was no sale involved. What we wanted was to connect people through wine. And one of the things that we found out was that there was this very big gap between people who were experts in wine and who were very frequent. They were wine geeks. They knew a lot of information about wine, and all these people who wanted to know more about wine, but because of language, because of the way the wine world was structured, were kept out of this industry and didn't feel welcome. And so the internet helped lower this barrier, because suddenly we have all these pockets of information like Adegga and so many others that ended up creating this forum, if you want, different forums with different levels of knowledge that made people feel accepted Some people believe this is the place that I want to learn more about wine, because this is a place I can relate to. Of course, you had other important websites, but information was very technical there, and so people didn't feel very comfortable. And so what we ended up doing at that time, it's actually a project that is now suspended for many years, but it was an exciting project that we did at the time called AVIN. And so what we did was we created an ISBN for wine. So we thought, you have an ISBN, and that helps Amazon structure all these wines. We can create a number, the same kind of logic, but it would be attributed to each wine. We found out some years later that the complexity of the wine world was far bigger than we had ever expected. Right. And the project is now suspended, and you have people like, and you have apps like Vivino and others doing an amazing work to try to get to a database of wine information, because I do believe that we need more and better information on the internet so that we can start valuing the internet more. So it's the two things need to grow. We need to select the channels better, but we also need the channels to be better at doing what they do with sharing information with us. Actually, what is happening today, as we know with all media, not just wine media, is that we have more and more closed silos. And so information is available, but is available behind a paywall. And so in a way, we're also losing that openness of the internet. And I think it will be very important in the future to have more open systems so that people can access these systems without the commitment of paying for them. But we'll need to find solutions to build them, because they do cost money, and that's why paywalls exist. But it's at the same time a complex problem, but also a critical problem that we need to solve to make sure wine is at the same level as all other areas of business and of interest around the world. And wine is still a bit behind it in that sense.
It's so interesting too, because there's the wine industry often really resists technology. You know, like there's a way in which a lot of wine aficionados really want to hold on to the romance, and there's an assumption that the romance depends on eschewing technology, that, you know, not using it, but then yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say that in a way I do understand the romantic part and why people are connected to it, but I would be maybe a bit more harsh on that, in the sense that what is happening, a wine business is a business. And so in a sense, it does have the romantic side and all that, but it needs to be run professionally. And I think one of the things that is happening that is making the industry lag behind is not the lack of interest, is the lack of hiring professionals who know what they're doing with the internet, the same way you hire a very good winemaker to make your wine, and the same way you hire the best salesman that you can. We need to look, we go back to the topic of the internet being something we need to look at with some more seriousness, because if we look at digital as something serious, we'll try to get the best possible person to do that job inside any winery around the world. And if we have better professionals doing that, we'll have a better acceptance of digital on wineries.
Yes, no, it's such an important point, because there's, I think people forget wine is a business, and that it's actually possible. In fact, if we want to kind of preserve the romantic sides of wine, we actually have to run a smart business, because the romantic sides and the pleasures of wine can only be maintained by actually maintaining a business, by staying in business. And I think, actually, you know, oh, please. Go ahead. Well, and I was just going to say, you know, businesses have become digital, and that means wine is not only an agricultural product, because wine is also business. Wine must be digital. But one of the things that you said earlier is that I really love too, is just that the approachability of aspects of the internet, and that it's, you know, I haven't heard it said as much recently, but a few years ago, one of the comments that was being made quite regularly was this idea of the democratization of wine, that it's become something for everyone, so that the role of the expert has shifted. It's not that we've gotten rid of experts, but that the role they have has shifted, and what we need them for has changed. That wine lovers have a lot more access to tools to empower them to make decisions themselves. And, you know, social media is one of these tools. But one of the things that I also hear in what you're saying is that there is so much complexity in wine that can be very alienating. And social media and other, you know, social platforms like Adegga have helped alleviate some of that alienation problem. But this is something that I hear you talk about quite a bit. And so I was hoping you could address that idea. You know, from a different perspective, kind of getting back to the agricultural side, people are more used to hearing in the conversation about wine. You made the comment, Portugal has more than 250 unique varieties, right, that are indigenous to Portugal. That is incredible. And even if you look at the map of Portugal, there's so much information just in the map of regions. So in both cases, the technology of wine, the varieties of wine, the information of wine, these are very complex topics. How do we make these approachable? You know, a lot of your work in wine has been around this question. How do we make these approachable for people that want to learn, that do want to connect? How do we expand that conversation?
So one of the things I'll say, and it might be a bit controversial, especially with this kind of audience, but I actually love wine influencers. And I know we all have some sort of, you know, feeling with wine influencers. And and of course, again, you have bad apples everywhere, so they will be there too. But the reason I love wine influencers is because every time one of these wine influencers posts a picture of them somewhere with a bottle, they're actually working for the wine industry. Of course, you will have examples of something that doesn't work, but most of these people are actually respectful of the wine, and they're promoting a wine culture. They're promoting something that it's not about how the wine was made and all these technical details. They're actually doing our job. They're helping us promote wine to all these different, and we've talked about this, to all these different levels of knowledge. And when I talk about levels of knowledge, I also talk about the price of the bottle, that you don't need to be an expert to be drinking a €1,000 bottle. Of course, it helps if you have the knowledge. You might even have a different kind of pleasure because you're enjoying something you know. But at the same time, if someone wants to enjoy that bottle that they found on some other Instagram, and they're not only paying $1,000, but they're actually helping the producer who sold that bottle, I'm all for it. And I think that's a really really big change that we need to do when it comes to social media, that we need to look at these things as something that is actually beneficial if we look at the good examples. The other thing is about, and of course, coming from Portugal, where most of the winery names and most of the region names and most of the wine grapes are unpronounceable or hard to pronounce for most people, I think it's really interesting that we try different approaches, because no one is going to learn a new language just because, or most people are not going to learn a new language just because they like a wine from a certain country. Some will, but most people won't. So how do we break that barrier? How do we make people who don't know a certain country start getting interested in asking for the things that they want from that country? And I think one of the things that we should be doing is maybe we do need to create some sort of, for example, for Portugal, it works really well to focus on a number of varieties instead of 250. Maybe we should start with 10 or 15, which is what has been done in the last 10, 20 years. But at the same time, we need to find interesting ways of communicating those varieties. I have a few examples here of wineries that have really, really interesting names in Portuguese. And when they're funny. And when you translate them to English, they're funny to anyone, so you'll remember them. So one of them is called Amor Não Me Deixes. What I just said is actually love, please don't leave me. This is the name of a variety, and it's being used in Portugal. So it's one of those things that if you make fun of it, it's hard to pronounce, but you'll remember it. And remembering it is the first step to trying to understand others. I'll give you another one, a one called Long Foot, which is in Portuguese, pé comprido. So long foot is something you'll remember. Of course, it's hard to remember pé comprido. And you have one that is not so friendly to animals, but it's called Dog Strangler. And it actually has a history behind it, because the reason why it's called Dog Strangler is because the local farmers found out that some of the dogs were trying to eat these varieties, and they would, it would be hard for them to eat some of these grapes. And so they started calling these grapes esganacão, which is dog strangler. And this is one of the things, if we tell stories about some of these varieties, maybe we'll get people to get more interested in doing this. What we can't do is trying to teach people in a formal classroom that people need to learn this as they learn other stuff in school. No, there's different ways of teaching. And again, I'll maybe use a controversial example, but I see people dismissing it right from the start. I'll mention TikTok.
Mm-hmm.
And it does seem something very playful and something that is just for people to make fun of other people or to be doing all these dances and everything. There are lawyers, bankers, there are business people at this moment trying to understand how to pass information to an audience that is watching a video on TikTok. It's not my favorite media. Also, it's not something I'm interested in using, but I understand that there's a generation that will be influenced by that channel. And if we want that generation to be interested in wine, we need to understand how do we communicate through that channel. The same region, the generation before me had to understand how to communicate wine through the internet. And we're still learning, we'll always be learning, but we're closer to something that works than we were before. And I think, so what cannot be is, this cannot be static. We cannot stop learning how to communicate. Master classes and printed magazines and points and tasting notes worked really well in the past. They still do. There is formal education that is really important for people that take it. But I think we should look at other ways of communicating wine, and we should be more friendly in welcoming them to our world of experts.
Well, and I think what you're getting at too is a really important point, that we need to expand what we assume education looks like, so that there is, kind of once you've committed, once you understand you're committed to wine, then formal classroom style education makes a lot of sense. But if we're actually talking about expanding the audience of wine and helping to make it more approachable and accessible to people that are newer to it, the classroom is almost irrelevant. It's so far down the road in the conversation, in the development of a wine lover, so to speak. But
and I'll give you, go ahead.
Well, I just was going to say, what you're describing are examples of, information sharing in unexpected forms. And I think one of the really great lessons that wine can take from what you just described too, that you didn't quite mention, but I think it was implicit in what you were saying, is like making it fun, lover, oh my love, please don't leave me. The idea that a grape has that name, that's really funny, and so charming. But also a lot of the videos in TikTok and wine videos in TikTok are actually, they make you laugh for a second, and you're taking in the information in a new way at the same time. It is actually a form of information sharing, obviously, but also a form of education. We're actually expanding the audience by expanding the conversation through these different platforms.
And I'll use another example that is related to price and how we normally see consumers who want to pay for an expensive bottle but don't have the knowledge, or we assume they don't have enough knowledge to be drinking that. At one of our wine markets many years ago, we created this room. It was an experimental room where we had 50 of the best wines in Portugal available to taste at least once. So people could taste each of the 50 at least once, and they had to pay a more expensive ticket than the normal ticket to get in and taste. The only thing was that you had a couple of sommeliers. You had actually 3 sommeliers in the room that were available to talk to you if you wanted to learn more about those wines. But if you just wanted to taste the wines, sit on the back, enjoy one of the wines, come back an hour later and enjoy another, you could do whatever you want. Mm-hmm. And we actually had wines that went from like a vertical of white wines from Vinho Verde to 100-year-old port. So we had really amazing top wines, some of them very expensive in their room, but we were not doing a formal masterclass because we wanted that to be open. If people want to learn, masterclasses are important and they should exist, but we should be looking at other channels where people might feel comfortable around the bottle of 250 or $1,000 if they feel comfortable around that bottle. And actually, if there's an opportunity because they feel comfortable of us explaining a bit more because they felt comfortable enough to ask for it, like in the situation of their room, then we've created something new that works. That makes sense.
Yes, I mean, I just think it's part of this seems to be, you know, what's common with TikTok or social media or the wine tasting experience you just described, you know, so that would be a wine event context. That what I'm hearing as a common thread is these are all answers to the question, how do we welcome people into wine? And I think that's something we forget. Again, if, you know, there's a need to expand the audience for wine. And again, because of a business need, right? We need to expand sales for wine to survive. But doing that can happen by expanding the audience, but that becomes the need to welcome people into wine and share the experiences in these different ways. It looks like André might have frozen for a second. This is one of, oh, there he goes. We problem solved in advance. So you've switched computers. And so one of the things
I did, I'm here.
I was just saying, you know, we need to think about welcoming people into wine in these different ways. But one of the things that I know you and I were wanting to talk about too is, you know, a lot of this is getting at the future of wine and how there's these shifting conversations. And again, these are not only shifting conversations based on wine lovers. These conversations are actually influencing how producers are making their wine, what choices they're making about what to grow or what fruit to seek out. And we're seeing kind of a shifting in how people collaborate. And so I know one of the things that you wanted to talk about was just this idea of collaboration and how we're seeing that in wine, both at the information sharing side and in the producer side as well. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, you asked a really interesting question last week when we first spoke about what would I change, what would I add to the wine world that would make the wine world a better place. And we were talking in that context, we were talking about online, and online is so important. But I use the word collaboration, and I use that word because I do see that every time we have, well, first thing is we do need to collaborate more. In terms of something very simple, which is financial sustainability. The wine world has a number of challenges that we can overcome if we work together. And then we need to find out, of course, how can we do that financially in a financially sustainable way. But at the same time, I do have a number of examples, and I learned from you that you also have some examples of how we've seen people in the past who maybe they're not as well known for doing all these collaborations, but when you look at what they've done in terms of collaboration, they've contributed in a way that is so much bigger than anything else we've seen in the wine world. And so, and of course, we also know practical examples, and we'll get to that in terms of the publishing industry. But one of the examples that I would love to talk about is something that has been happening, I think, for 3 or 4 years in Portugal with a producer called Dirk Niport, which many will have heard of. Not only he was one of the founders of still wine in the Douro. So in the early 90s, he was one of the first young winemakers to start playing around with more than just port. But he's been doing his job for many years of course of promoting the Douro, but always doing it in very different ways from everyone else. And so not only he has created a group that is known as the Dodo Boys, and it was a group of 5 wineries that got together to collaborate and promote the Douro as a high-end wine region. And that has been one of, I would say, in my opinion, is one of the things that has influenced more people around the world to look at the Douro in a different way. But he's unstoppable. And so more recently, he started a new project called NetCool. And NetCool's goal is to make this more easy, friendly, approachable kind of wines. But instead of just him doing his own NetCool wines, he's actually been inviting different winemakers from different parts of Portugal and giving them an opportunity, a stage for them to show themselves, and actually using the resources and the network of Newport to sell those wines. So something that would be very hard for, as it is for so many winemakers, to start to do business and to have a distribution network and to have some visibility. A project like Netcool kind of creates those conditions, and he's doing that, of course, out of interest of promoting Portugal and promoting the Douro and promoting all the other regions. But he's helping and he's collaborating in a way that I see has been very innovative in the wine world. It's, in my opinion, it should be the rule. It should be the way people work, because the wine business needs those kinds of collaborations, and we can learn so much from it. But you do see this example has one of the, I think, most exciting examples coming out of Portugal at the moment. And I know you have a great example to share with us.
Well, and I love that the example of Newport, because it's such a case of an established, successful, respected producer using that resource, the resource of himself, so to speak, and everything he's established to help bring up the next generation. Because, you know, Dirk emerged in Douro at a time when there was kind of the space to try something completely new, but we needed the person to do the thing that was completely new for it to happen. And Dirk was one of the very first people to make a still table wine from the Douro, which was historically established as a sweet wine region. And now it's almost taken for granted that, of course, there's table wine in the Douro, but it depended on somebody being bold enough to try an entirely new thing. And, you know, when we spoke last week, you asked me to think about and address today the question of like, what, you know, it's taken for granted now that California is one of the world's great wine regions, but you asked me to talk about, you know, what made California one of the world's great wine regions rather than just another region that makes wine. And, you know, I think a lot of people point to the Paris tasting where California, you know, showed itself to be, you know, at a comparable level to France. But in my mind, the Paris tasting is just a moment we can point to. It's not the moment that made California great. The Paris tasting was relevant and had an impact only because a lot of other conditions were already in place. You know, so the American public was drinking more dry table wine than sweet wine for the first time in history. The cost of farming was lower than the cost of buying grapes for the first time in history. And so because, and this gets to your point about financial sustainability, because producers could actually make a little bit of money by farming grapes for the first time, they could actually start thinking through and experimenting with what they wanted to grow and how they wanted to grow it. If your farming is more expensive than your fruit, you don't put a lot of thought into your farming. You just don't have the time, you know? And so those two things were in place. But the other really important thing that was in place was California was actually collaborating. Producers here in California were collaborating, working with each other in order to really diligently figure out what's the best work we can do with what we have here. And one of the examples that I think is so important and in some ways parallels what you're describing with Newport is the original Robert Mondavi winery. You know, he was started in 1966, but the thing that Robert Mondavi did that was so unique was it was almost like a workshop environment. When you talk to producers that were, you know, they're either as an enologist or a winemaker or a viticulturist, there's a way in which, you know, that original Robert Mondavi winery became the sort of incubator training ground for many of the world's top producers. And the thing was, they were all working together in the cellar, tasting the world's great wines every day while making their own wine, and also intentionally traveling to Europe to see what producers there were doing, and then coming back and sharing those ideas again, and really in this collaborative environment, really making wine. And if you look at the history of producers that went through Robert Mondavi, and as you were pointing out last week too, also Charles Krug, you know, the kind of brother wineries, they, if we were to draw a map of influence, starting just with those two places, the fan out to then founding many of California's great wineries, but also then founding great wine projects all around the world. It starts with this idea that we can work together, we can learn together, and that collaboration is going to make us better, but it's also going to make the community of wine better, which is unique. I think that's another important point to make that's implicit in a lot of what we're saying. To improve your own perception of wine, your own access to wine, your own understanding of wine, and to improve your own quality of wine as a producer, you actually have to also be seeing the community around you improving. Like the two support each other. And so collaboration actually becomes a really important foundational point to improving access and improving quality, both.
Yeah, it's amazing how you can think of someone and then try to see all these dots that originated from him and created their own networks and gave origin to so many other projects. And you definitely see this with Dirk as well. Of course, Dirk is not the only producer who started producing table wines at that time.
Yes.
He was one of the few that had a vision and had the willingness to do something about it that made others believe that it was possible. And as we've talked about, all the great regions in the world have these people at some point in history that were able to see that the region and the country could be so much more than it was what it was when they started. And that's something that we need to give them all the credit for, because they've worked so hard to make it happen. And it's something that has a legacy that crosses generations then, because it started there so strong that will continue to influence people throughout the years.
Yes, I think Dirk is a younger generation than Mondavi, but Dirk Newport, but he's had that parallel role where if you were to draw a circle of influence, he's helped. He's not only been making his own wine, he's been consulting on, in the DAO, in Barada, in Vino Verde, and he's another person that, his vision for what he can do in the Douro actually is also very strongly informed by him consistently traveling the world to learn from producers all over the world, which is another form of kind of connection and access and collaboration. And then he goes back and he asks, how can these things inspire what I do here?
And I think a really important point when you're being an entrepreneur and doing these things is accepting failure. And not all of the wines I've tasted from Dirk are amazing. I've tasted some of his experiments that didn't go well and he stopped doing them. But people sometimes think of Dirk as someone who can fail. They can also fail. They can also try something, and if it doesn't work, do something else. Of course, do it in a small scale if possible, but do it, try it out. And from many of the experiments, from many of the things, Dirk was, for example, one of the first people, it was the first person to actually put a price of a white wine in the Douro above 30 euros. It was unthinkable. And at the time, the fact that he decided to do that was something out of this world. How can you charge so much for a white wine from the Douro? And today, not only that wine is very, very respected, but also it set the bar for all the other wines to work with. And so everything is related to that. And of course, all around Europe, but in Portugal specifically, with two different universities forming many winemakers through the last 20 years, and having, of course, European funds to help develop these wineries. The country has been from the back of the wine producing countries to the forefront, and of course now it's top 10 country, and it's highly regarded as a good wine country, as one of the best wine countries producing amazing wines. But I think it has to do with that combination of having the means to do it, like the money and the education. The university in Vila Real, just in the Douro, is so important these days. If you think again of this network of people who influenced other people, the University of Vila Real is something so important because it formed all the winemakers that not only sometimes own wineries, but end up going to work for these wineries. And you need generations and generations to continue doing this work. There's another pivotal moment in the history of modern Portuguese wine, which was there was a first generation of 10 winemakers that went to do their internships outside of Portugal, in Australia, in Bordeaux, and those people are the ones who are leading the major wine houses today in Portugal, and being, of course, at the forefront of high quality wine in Portugal. And that was so important to have this, to make sure that you do need the people who have the vision, but then you need the education. And again, here we're talking winemaking, you need the formal education. We're talking about something that the more knowledge you have, of course, the better you are at what you do. And all those levels help put Portugal at the place where it is right now.
Yes, it's so important too. Like I think it's in some ways it might not be obvious, the idea, why would a Portuguese winemaker go do a stage in Australia? Like the link is not obvious there, but as you're pointing out, it's actually been a really important connection, because that idea of going to a place that maybe has some parallels but is quite different, and then seeing how it reinvigorates, re-inspires your vision for your own project, it's so important. And I see that in California as well. And part of why I wanted us to have this conversation today is, again, California and Portugal in a conversation is not necessarily obvious, but I think as we're moving forward in wine, whether it's through communication online or actual wine production or wine sales, because again, it is a business, we have to be looking to sources of inspiration where there is some parallel, but actually a lot of new things to learn. And in order to ask, what can we learn that's new? And so I really, I appreciate you bringing that up. And just as one, we're essentially out of time actually, but I wonder if you could just briefly comment on, the challenge of bringing in, you need to hire the best, right? If you're going to digital, you need to hire the best, but wine businesses often resist that idea with the justification that, well, they don't know enough about wine, so it's not going to work. How do we resolve that tension? And then we need to finish up. But
you mean that consumers don't know enough about wine, or
no, I'm sorry. When we're hiring professionals for our businesses and
Yeah.
we're looking for the best in what they do, but maybe they don't have the wine knowledge. How do we make those decisions? What's the best choice?
It is definitely one of the biggest challenges, that we have great digital professionals that don't understand the context of wine, and so it makes it hard for them. But the same way you hire a young winemaker when you don't have sometimes the money to hire a really experienced guy, if more companies start hiring some of these people to try to understand, some of the younger people, the younger professionals, they're not used to any area. It's not wine, it's not fashion, it's not anything. They will learn how to work in fashion. Why can't they learn how to work with wine? Wine has many specificities. We just need to, and here we talk about we could talk for hours about the mentoring part. Yes. Why not have an intern and then mentor them to understand about wine? Because you might have all the knowledge about wine, but you don't have about digital. Maybe you can learn a little bit about digital, and they can learn so much about wine. And I'm sure most of the people will fall in love with wine anyway when they start learning. And so it's a big opportunity to work together and learn how can wine be communicated through digital, even from the person who doesn't understand wine is closer to your consumer than you are.
Right.
Because consumers don't. And that's an opportunity.
Well, it's an opportunity for you to learn, how do I connect to these people? I'm so used to talking about wine. How do I connect to people less used to it? Well, when you hire someone who's has an expert in video or in the internet or whatever, or digital sales, if they know less about wine, you become the wine resource, they become a new communication resource, and you end up mentoring each other in an interesting way.
Exactly.
Well, we're out of time. We've actually gone a little bit over. I have to say that was the fastest session we've done so far. I feel like we talked for about 5 minutes, but it was actually more than an hour. And so, André,
we can do another 2 hours.
Yes, exactly. It's so good to see you, and so good to have this time to talk with you. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Elaine. Thank you, André. A recording of today's webinar will be published to the California Wine Institute's YouTube channel in the next couple of days, and all of you will receive an email with the link to that recording. And remember, you can access all of the previous Behind the Wines episodes on the YouTube channel. So we hope you will join us next week as we continue this chapter of the series. Elaine will speak with British wine writer and educator Wink Lork, currently based in France, and the conversation will take place on Tuesday, September 15th at 10 a.m. Pacific. So thank you again, and wishing you all a safe and enjoyable week.